Well, hello, everyone. I'm Tony Kirby, and I'm going to talk about the Fens, an area I've been familiar with since the 1960s, when I first came to Cambridge by train. And from Lincoln southwards, the landscape just seemed to be boring beyond belief, all the way to Cambridge. There was the light relief of Ely Cathedral, blessed relief of Ely Cathedral, and the rest of it just stretched away to infinity. I thought, how on earth do people live here? How on earth do they make their living? And over the next 40 or 50 years, teaching history at what was then Cambridge Tech, and later, of course, Anglia Ruskin University, I was able to explore and find out rather more about a region which has got a fascination all of its own, as I hope I shall be able to show you today. The Fenland is a unique landscape with a unique history, and what I want to do in this talk is to explain how the landscape has been shaped by human activity since the 17th century, and how the agricultural economy of the region has evolved as a result of that. The landscape we see today is essentially the creation of the past 400 years, but there have been attempts to reclaim and exploit the fens for centuries before 1600, right back to prehistoric times. There'd been a lot of activity by the Romans, and also in the early Middle Ages, from about 1100 to 1300, during a period of great population pressure, and also a period of relatively good climate, when it was easy to actually drain at least part of the fens. The late 16th, early 17th centuries have a period of very renewed interest in fen drainage because of several factors. The first was population growth, particularly in London, which during the 16th century had grown from a population of about 1,500 in 50,000 in 1500 to about 200,000 in 1600. As a result of this, it's also a period of inflation, rising food prices. And the further factor is the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. The monasteries have been great Fenland landowners, and their estates very quickly passed to a new generation of owners, people who'd made their money in areas other than agriculture, lawyers, businessmen, etc. They got a much more hard-headed and business-like approach to the management of the fens, and of course, a very keen appreciation of profit and loss. And a further factor was, for the first time, you started to get reasonably accurate maps of the fens, such as John Speed's map of 1610, which we can see here, which is the first really accurate depiction of what the fens were like. And these maps seem to show an empty, unpopulated region, a great waste of natural resources and, as we say today, ripe for development. Now, this view, which was an outsider's view, ignored the fact that the fens had for centuries had a very well-developed economy. The northern fens, the slightly higher silt fens, had grown rich on sheep rearing in the Middle Ages. And the southern fens, the peat fens, the black fens, as they're sometimes known, had got a rather different economy, but based on exploiting local products such as reeds and fish and wildfowl, and the grazing of animals from the surrounding upland parishes in the summer. This was totally overlooked, and a contemporary pamphlet alleged that the proponents of drainage had, quote, misinformed many parliament men that all the fens is a mere quagmire. And the wealth of medieval Fenland can be shown, for example, here at Walpole St. Peter in Norfolk on the Silt Fens, and one of a great series of marshland churches that stretch from Wisbeach across the King's Lynn, and built on the proceeds of the medieval wool trade. Well, in 1630, a group of Fenland landowners and London financiers were authorised by Parliament to undertake the drainage of the fens. Officially known as the governor, bailiffs, and commonalty of the Company of the Conservative of the Fens, they were usually simply called the adventurers because they were supplying venture capital to carry out the project. And there were two important figures here. The leading man was the 4th Earl of Bedford, Again, one of the new men that had emerged in the 16th century, and hence the name Bedford Level, which still appears on modern ordnance survey maps. He was the biggest of the Fenland landowners. He'd acquired the estates at Thorney, but of course he's not an engineer. And to undertake the work, it has to be done professionally, and the obvious person to call was the Dutch engineer Cornelius Vermoyden. Here is Russell himself, and he is a man who got a finger in a lot of pies. He was responsible for the development of Covent Garden, the beginnings of London's suburbanisation. And as you can see on the portrait, he was a Puritan. But he was essentially a moderate Puritan. He was trusted by both sides, both the Puritans and the Royalists in the very fractious politics of the 1630s. And had he not died of smallpox in 1641, it's quite conceivable he might have been able to find the middle way to avoid the English Civil War. And here is Vermoyden. A Dutchman born in Zeeland, came to England in 1621 and had been working in the 1620s on the reclamation of Canvey Island in the Thames estuary, and from 1626 at Hatfield Chase on the borders of Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, the area where the Trent and the Ouse meet to form the Humber. He's the foremost drainage engineer of the day, he's got royal patronage, and he was the obvious choice to undertake this very ambitious project. And this is what he was faced with. A complex network of waterways straggling across the Fens, all of which had to deal with both local water from the Fens themselves, and also, particularly in the winter, water coming down the rivers, the Nene, the Ouse and the Cam, from the surrounding higher ground. And the problem, of course, is that the Fens are very flat, the rivers have got virtually no gradient, and so it was very difficult getting upland water out to the sea, and flooding was really an inescapable fact of life. Vermoyden's solution was to cut off the big loop of the Ouse round by Ely by constructing a new channel from Erith to Denver, together with subsidiary drains from the outlying areas. This channel was now known as the Old Bedford River, was constructed in the 1630s, but there was a great deal of local opposition, sometimes taking the form of direct action, for example at Wycombe, where there were riots against fen drainage, and it was only partially successful. It managed to drain the Fens in the summer, producing what were called the summer grounds, but they were still at risk of flooding in the winter. Work was interrupted by the Civil War, but in 1649, work resumed. And the second New Bedford River, the parallel river, was dug, much of the labour coming from Scottish and Dutch prisoners of war, working in appalling conditions. And this was accompanied by building sluices at Erith and Denver, and the land between the two Bedford rivers, the washes, acted as a vital overflow in the winter, as it still does. And here is the New Bedford River, the greatest civil engineering work in Britain since the Romans. And it's incredible to think that this was dug entirely by hand, no earth-moving machinery of any sort. This is hundreds of these prisoners of war toiling away at all times of year, in all weathers, to build the river. And this is the view looking northwards. And here we can see the two rivers acting as they were intended to do. On the left-hand side, we've got the Old Bedford River, the 1630s. On the right-hand side, the New Bedford. And the area in between, as you can see, is flooded. It's acting as a reservoir, protecting the surrounding land from flooding. And this is what it looked like when Vermoyden had finished. The new artificial cuts, the two Bedford rivers very obviously there, going across at the southeastern corner of the map, and the various other drains as well. And to celebrate the completion of the drainage works in 1658, the commissioners of the Bedford level commissioned a map of what they'd achieved, carried out by Jonas Moore, their surveyor. And here is the map showing all the works that have been achieved by the period. The Bedford level, of course, no longer exists. It ceased to exist in the 1930s, but there is still one visible reminder of it, which is the coat of arms of the company on the old Fenn office in Ely. And in a sense, it's quite symbolic. It shows on the left a navvy, as we would call them now, with a spade, one of the drainers. And on the right, you've got the interests of agriculture, symbolized by a man with a scythe. And it looked as if fen drainage had been solved. In fact, it hadn't. By about 1720s, perhaps even earlier, problems are becoming apparent. You get peat shrinkage from the soil drying out and natural wastage through bacterial action and fungi, which meant that the land was actually sinking. The drains are finding it more and more difficult to cope with the water. The flood banks themselves are deteriorating because they'd only been built out of peat, and water was seeping through them back onto the drained land. And they were also used by the locals as roads and droveways, driving cattle along them, for example, which led to further deterioration. The Bedford Level Corporation simply didn't have the money to deal with these problems, and so local landowners took the initiative up themselves, setting up internal drainage commissions and very quickly adopting windmills to assist drainage. This was very much following the Dutch model. And there were a very large number of these windmills. And these are the ones erected by the internal drainage commissioners during the course of the 18th century. And these are simply the major ones. It excludes the many small mills that were erected by private landowners to drain their own holdings, as, for example, the one at Wycombe Fenn, which you can still see today. And here in 1835 are some of the great windmills of the Fens, which of course have almost totally disappeared from the landscape today. This is a painting by John Sell Cotman of mills in the Fens near what at the time was called Croyland, we would call it Crowland. And what's happening here, in fact, is that you've got a series of windmills reflecting continued peat shrinkage. Basically, you've got one windmill lifting water to the next one, which lifts water to the third one, and the final one manages to lift the water into the river. It was, of course, a very time-consuming project to do all of this. And a further factor, of course, is that the windmills could only work when it was actually windy. And a major problem was that often periods of high water did not coincide with periods when there was anything like an appreciable wind blowing. And the consequence was that by the end of the century, the Fens were once again in a very bad way, not helped by the fact that there was a period of very poor weather from about 1790 through to 1799, again in the early 19th century. And all the accounts of the Fens at this period suggest that drainage has more or less ceased to be effective. And Charles Vancouver, writing in 1794, says that the Fens of Littleport are rendered extremely precarious. In Soham, you've got the bad state attributed to the constant pressure of the highland waters through the banks. And Vancouver estimated that, in fact, only about 25% of the Fens were effectively drained. And matters were made worse by parliamentary enclosure in the surrounding upland areas, which meant more effective drainage of the land around the Fens and consequently higher water levels in the main rivers. And Arthur Young, the great agricultural writer, in 1805 foretold the total ruin of the whole district if nothing was done. And this is probably what the Fens were looking like by the late 18th century, not being able to be used for grain crops with any security at all, but very important for cattle raising, where the occasional flooding and indeed water standing on the land all through the way through the summer was no handicap to the fattening of cattle, which had normally been driven down from Scotland, from Wales, down the drove roads, down the roads that were parallel to the Great North Road, and fattened on the Fens before being driven again up to London to market. The solution to the problems of the early 19th century was steam. And here we've got if you like, a hymn to the power of steam, the foundation stone of the engine on burnt Fenn, built in 1842, which talks about steam, mighty steam, ascending the throne, and reigns Lord Paramount alone. And over the next 50 years or so, the steam engine has become one of the very prominent features of the Fens. And of course, today there is only real Listretum, which was thankfully preserved, which reminds us of what the Fenland pumping engines looked like. Here is Streatham, which is draining the water beach level on the right and lifting the water into the old West River, the old course of the River Ouse, on the left. And looking at it from the water beach level side, you can see here very clearly what the engine looked like. In the center, you've got the engine house. It's a vertical engine, a Belton and Watt engine. On the left-hand side, you've got the boiler house. And on the right-hand side here, you've got the scoop wheel. And this is the scoop wheel, which physically lifted water from the engine drain, which is here in the foreground, up into the river. And Peter Philby, who is one of the great experts on steam engines, produced this map showing where the main Fenland engines were by 1900. And as you can see, there are a lot of them wherever you looked over this flat landscape. It would have been punctuated by the vertical accent of the engine chimneys. And the greatest mid-Victorian achievement was the drainage of the last really large stretch of open water in the Fens in 1851, 1852, Whittlesea Mere. And this marked quite a change in approach. Here is Whittlesea Mere as it was in the late 17th century, and it was a valuable local leisure resource, as well as being used for fishing, etc. There were regattas held during the summer. It was used for fence skating, etc. And although there was some opposition to the drainage of Whittlesea Mere, it was carried out in 1852, and it was important because it's the first time that a pump rather than a scoop wheel is used. The Apple centrifugal pump, which had been exhibited, as you can see here, at the Crystal Palace in 1851, and which was used at Whittlesea, here is the actual engine house, to carry out the drainage. The effect of steam was that peat shrinkage, which had been already apparent with the windmills, becomes even faster. And the home Fenn post is a famous and dramatic illustration of this. It was in 1852, it was a column from the Crystal Palace. It was driven into the ground with its head level with the surface. And it's now something like 4 meters above ground level. This area is actually 2 meters below sea level itself. But this is what has happened in the course of about 170 years in terms of shrinkage. There are a lot of other engineering works being carried out at the time, straightening of the rivers, particularly the area north of Ely, where there had been a big loop of the Ouse between Ely and Littleport, and this was cut off by Sandal's Cut, the middle level main drain of 1848, and most significantly, in fact, the improvement of the outfalls of the 2 major rivers, the Ouse and the Nene, to carry the waters to the sea. And there was also some reclamation around the southern shores of the Wash. But there was a grand scheme in the 1850s for a full-scale reclamation of the Wash to be known as Victoria County. This was proposed, but it never came to fruition. And this map of 1830 shows 2 of the major improvements to the outfalls. Here is the Obrint Cut, carrying the waters of the Ouse much more rapidly down to the sea and cutting off this big loop, as you can see here, out past Tilney and Clenchwarton, which was now simply abandoned. And over here on the western side of the map, the new channel of the River Nene. which was constructed between about 1790 and 1830. Again, this whole area had been simply marshland, had been extremely difficult to cross, and the reclamation of the area is accompanied by the building of a causeway and bridge at Sutton Bridge here, very quickly easing communications between King's Lynn and Lincolnshire. And one effect of the Nene drainage and improvement was to finally give Wisbech a secure shipping channel, which it had always lacked. It had been very difficult for seagoing ships to access Wisbech. They had to anchor well out in the Wash. And by 1840, Wisbech was the largest grain shipping port in the country. And luckily, it was photographed, while it was still important as a port, by the local photographer Samuel Smith in the mid-1850s. But this was really the end of Wisbech's trade. The railways very quickly took over from the 1850s onwards. Surprisingly, perhaps, there was no major expansion of settlement in the Fens after drainage. You do get some new farmsteads, obviously, some cottages, and this is a very good example of a 18th century cottage, Canary Cottage, just off the A47 near Thorney, and one or two small hamlets such as Welsh's Dam, Ponders Bridge, and Ramsey St Mary's. Most Fenland farmers continued to live where they always had, in the villages, and a very good example of this is Cottenham, going out to cultivate their land during the day, coming home to the village at night. There is one rather curious exception to this. The Owenite colony at Mainey, established in 1838. This was a great idea of cooperative living. Everybody working together for the common good. And it did not succeed after it collapsed after 5 years amidst a great deal of internal squabbling. Its importance is perhaps that it gave Cambridgeshire its very first railway. And you can see here the horse-drawn tramway connecting the agricultural land to the Old Bedford River here. The result of all of this activity was that by the 1850s, it looked as if the Fenland was secure for all time. And this is the period from 1850 through to 1875 or thereabouts that's sometimes called the golden years of English farming. There's continued population growth in the towns. There's no foreign competition yet, in spite of the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. And landowners and tenant farmers have got a captive market and the encouragement to invest in new techniques and new machinery. And this is the period that's sometimes called high farming, which means the high application of capital to the land to produce high yields. And the dominant firm to take advantage of this were Ransoms of Whitford, who'd been set up in 1783, who were by far the most important suppliers of agricultural machinery, with many local engineering firms and blacksmiths acting as agents for them, and often putting their own names on Ransom's machinery. And here's a rather nice advert from about 1880 or thereabouts, I think, showing some of Ransom's ploughs and other implements in operation. And it does rather look as if there's going to be some catastrophic collision in a few minutes, but I think a bit of artistic license has been applied. Also, as a result of the new security of the Fens, you get a big development in the milling industry. And here at Downham Market, we've got a very good example of a mid-19th century mill. This is the Eagle Mills at Downham Market Station, built in 1849, and obviously built near the railway to take advantage of rail transport. As well as corn growing, industrial crops are also an important feature of the Fenland economy in the 19th century. And perhaps the most important was woad, which was grown for use in dyestuffs. And was grown particularly on the silt fens. And this illustration, this painting of the early 20th century, 1906, by James Doyle Penrose, who was married to one of the Peckovers, Wisbeach, and did a lot of paintings in the Fens. This is a rather, I think, romanticized view of woad harvesting in the Fen at Parson Drove. And here is a woad mill at Parson Drove, again, painted by Penrose in the early 20th century. It's very interesting because what's happening here, as you can see, is that the leaves and flowers are being crushed by a horse mill. Horses walking in a circular path, and the big crusher is going with them. These circular engine houses were a feature of Fenland farms, and very few of them, if any, survive today. At the same time, traditional crafts continue, reed gathering, as we can see here. But by 1875, there is a problem. And the problem was that for the first time, English farmers are facing foreign competition. Competition from the United States, from Canada, in terms of arable farming, and American and Canadian farmers were able to produce far more cheaply than their English counterparts, and even allowing for shipping costs across the Atlantic, their corn was cheaper than that being produced in the Fens. And this meant a catastrophic overnight decline in the fortunes of the Fens. By 1880, it was said that 50% of Fenland farmers were insolvent. And by the end of the century, a lot of the drainage works had simply been abandoned. The capital wasn't there to keep them up, the incentive wasn't there, and the land was reverting to rough pasture or simply lying derelict, just not worth the effort to farm. But there is a solution. The more adventurous farmers and landowners decided to switch production to livestock and also to growing fruit and vegetables for their towns. And the area around Wisbeach shows this very well. In 1850, there was only one orchard at Wisbeach. By 1900, as you can see here on the Ordnance Survey map, the town is surrounded by orchards, which the Ordnance Survey has very helpfully coloured green so we can see them. And what this doesn't show is also the fact that a lot of soft fruit is not being grown in orchards, simply being grown out in the fields. And here we've got a good example of this. This is gooseberry picking at Upwell in 1920. And of course, it is, as you can see here, a very labour-intensive process with workers coming in from as far afield as London. It's rather like the hop pickers of Kent coming out from the East End. The same thing happened in the Fens. And the side effect of all of this is that, in a sense, there could almost be overproduction. And the result is the growth of the canning industry to ensure that everything can be used. Smedleys are a good example of this. Smedleys are at Wisbeach, or were at Wisbeach. They were established in the very early 20th century, 1920, and rapidly become one of the biggest canning concerns in the country, producing here, as you can see, the ideal Christmas fare, garden peas, new potatoes, raspberries, blackberries, plums, etc. And all of this, both the fresh fruit and the canning industry, aided by the railways, which in terms of fresh fruit enable overnight delivery to urban markets. And the Wisbeach and Upwell Tramway of 1882 was built very largely to serve the fruit growing areas to the south of the town. This is the tram in Elm Road in Wisbeach, which has changed tremendously nowadays. And in Lincolnshire, where potatoes became particularly important, you get a network of narrow gauge railways being built to carry the potatoes from the fields to the mainline railheads. This is the one at Nocton, photographed in the 1930s. And in the borderlands between Norfolk and Suffolk, you get another agricultural tramway, the Whissington Railway. Again, built purely to serve agriculture. It ran from near Stoke Ferry over the Fens, several branches, a very complicated network, opened in 1906, built by a local landowner, a Mr. Keeble, and continued to operate down to 1957. it was increasingly, as you can see, rather decrepit towards the end. And this locomotive rather looks as if it fears it's about to run out of track in any moment. Water transport was also still important for carrying goods to and from the farms and the fens to the railheads. Fenland roads are still very bad in the right down to the First World War and beyond, and so barges were essential to carry produce down to the railway and to bring in things like fertilizers in return. And here we've got the dock at Downham Market off the River Ouse, which here is the dock, which still survives today. It's used as a marina. And here is the transshipment shed for loading produce onto the main line from Ely to King's Lynn. And the key to all of this was the great marshalling yards at Whitmore, just north of March, from where every night from about 11 o'clock onwards, a whole procession of fast freight trains left for the north and going up through West Falding and Sleaford to places like Manchester, Leeds, Bradford, Newcastle, etc., carrying Fenland produce. In the 1920s, the railways faced competition from road transport, newly developing, and the crucial period here was perhaps the 9 days of the general strike in May 1926, when lorry owners, haulage contractors, were quite simply able to take over a lot of the traffic that would have been carried by the railways, which did not return when the strike was over. And of course, lorries have got the great advantage that they could go to the farms and that they could also take the fruit direct to the consumer, or at least direct to the outlets that would be selling it. In Lincolnshire, South Lincolnshire, it wasn't fruit, it was bulb growing that became very big business. This starts in the 1880s when there was one bulb grower, 22 by 1892. And here we've got some of the pickers of the flowers. Livestock achieved, I think, a new importance during this period as well. This is an illustration of this. This is the cattle market at St Ives. And once again, what we're looking at here is cattle that are being fattened on the Fenland pastures and the fields of the lower Ouse Valley. And they're being sold mainly for onward transmission to London. This would, of course, by now be done by the railways. At the end of the First World War, there was another major agricultural depression. There'd been a temporary improvement in Fenland fortunes during the war because of obviously the need to produce as much food as possible domestically. There was a catastrophic price slump in 1920. The solution for Fenland agriculture was sugar beet, which was subsidized by the government from 1923 onwards, and that led to the construction of the major processing factories around the Fens, and this is the one at Ely. You can see here it's built near the railway to take advantage of railway communications. It has also got, as you can see, a large fleet of barges which are moored here on the Ouse. And again, because of the relatively poor state of the roads, these barges were used to bring the sugar beet from the farms down to the factory for processing and then onwards transmission by rail. But the Fens were still far from secure. Flooding was always a danger. The top illustration here is the 1912 floods, with the reed gathering being carried on regardless. And of course, there were the catastrophic floods of 1947, as shown in the bottom illustration. The creation of the Great Ouse River Authority in 1930 offered a potential solution, because for the first time, the whole of the River Ouse basin was brought under one control. And planning work for flood relief schemes was well underway by 1939, by the eve of the Second World War. They were given an added urgency by the 1947 floods, and the final major works of drainage were undertaken in the 1950s and 1960s. A relief channel on the lower Ouse from Denver to Lynn, the deepening and widening of the Ouse itself, And finally, the construction of the cut-off channel around the southeastern side of the Fens to intercept water from the rivers and to take it directly down to Denver Sluice. And this shows what was done in the post-war period. We've got here the relief channel paralleling the Ouse down to King's Lynn, which was, it must be said, rather opposed to the whole idea. King's Lynn feared it was going to be washed away by the new volume of water coming down the river. And here is the cut-off channel, and you can see it starts down here near Mildenhall, goes right around the edge of the Fens to just south of Littleport at Denver Sluice. The other major development in the post-war period, which reflects how things are changing, is the realization that rather than simply getting rid of the water from the Fens out into the sea, it ought to be used elsewhere, particularly in the very dry areas of Essex, which were undergoing major population growth in the post-war period. And the result of this is the Ely Ouse Essex Water Scheme, which was carried out by 1971, which involved carrying water from the cut-off channel at Blackdyke Intake here through a tunnel to Kennet, and then by a series of pipelines feeding into streams down to Wixow, and then eventually down to the reservoirs at Abberton and Hanningfield, which are down here near Chelmsford. This is the last major civil engineering work carried out so far. One of its big changes also in the post-war period is the change in labour. Fenland farming had always been very labour intensive, as we can see here with the potato harvest. And this was one factor, in fact, leading to Fenland villages not losing population during the late 19th century. Villages in South Cambridgeshire were, many of them falling by 25–30%. Fenland villages not only maintain their population, in some cases increase it. And the use of labour, intensive use of labour, continues into and beyond the Second World War. And one of the big things during the war, of course, was the use of the Women's Land Army. And here we've got Land Army girls in Huntingdonshire carrying out a harvest. Post-war, of course, mechanization takes over. Once again, we've got the application of capital replacing human effort. Sugar beet harvesting, which had been a monotonous, back-breaking job, very easily mechanized, as we can see here. And of course, vegetable growing also mechanized, although here, of course, it is still relatively labor intensive with all the problems that that's creating for Fenland farmers today, with the difficulty in actually getting sufficient labor to carry out the vegetable harvest. And matters have changed quite a lot. In the early 21st century, the emphasis moved from fen drainage towards what I think we would have to call rewilding. Around national nature reserves at Home Fen and Walton Fen in particular, the Great Fen Project was launched in 2001, effectively to enhance the natural habitat, preserve the peat, and particularly to capture carbon, which peat is very good at. And in south of the region, we've got the Wicken Fen vision. The idea that Wicken Fen, again, can be extended and rewilded almost down to the outskirts of Cambridge. These plans themselves, of course, may be overtaken. We have global warming, we have rising sea levels, and we may be one of the last generations who can actually explore and appreciate the unique character of the Fens, but only time will tell. And my acknowledgements go to all the people listed here and organizations for their help and for providing illustrations.